and welcome to another episode of Threat Update. I'm Kilian Englert, and joining me today is Kyle Roth. Kyle, how's it going?
I'm fantastic, Kilian. How about yourself?
Very good, thanks so much. So catching everybody up where we are in this series, we're covering sort of the next phase in what we call a big game ransomware attack. So up to this point, we've seen how an attacker can infiltrate an organization and then use DNS to perform DNS recon and learn about what else is on the network and other resources they might like to target. Now, at this stage in the game, the attacker's inside, and we see typically a few things that happen here. What often is the next step is the attacker wants to maintain persistency and elevate privileges to get access to more resources and a wider variety of things. Now, I say typically because there is one, I suppose, elephant in the room I do want to talk about. That's access to data and over-permissive access to data specifically. If the attacker compromises an account and the data that user has access to is not secured to least privilege or to a zero trust standard, that might be potentially all the attacker needs to do. If there's a ton of data open to everyone in the organization, the attacker can go straight after the data. So that's a big concern and something that we see a lot of people are concerned about. However, more often than not, we see the attackers still want to maintain that persistency and elevate permissions just in case their initial infiltration route is discovered. So what they'll do is they'll go after Active Directory at this point. We have two different attacks that we'd like to show very briefly to talk through things that, Kyle, I know you see doing investigations all the time. So pretty common stuff that attackers leverage in this case. The first one is going to be password spray, and the second one is going to be a Kerberoasting attack. And Kyle's going to walk us through really both of those and how they work. Kyle, you're all ready to go?
Yes, sir.
All right. So let's flip over, and we have a couple visual aids for everybody today to take a look. These are actually taken from our live attack labs that we do. I think we do at least one or several of them on a weekly basis. And I think, Kyle, you might run some of them, and I know our IR team runs some of them. So if anybody's interested, we'll put a link down below. You can request to come to an attack lab or join a Varonis event for an attack lab. And maybe you're lucky, Kyle might even do it for you. So you get a little celebrity bonus there.
Absolutely.
Good stuff. So Kyle, first one, let's take a look at a password spraying attack, if you'll walk us through that.
Yeah, so what you're seeing here is essentially, from an attacker's perspective on a Kali Linux box here, just kind of a bit of a rudimentary attempt, but nonetheless can be quite effective, depending on reconnaissance done beforehand, right? So in this case, a lot of organizations can quickly pick up on your standard brute force activity, where maybe you've got a list of passwords and one user you've honed in on, and you really are trying to crack it just by running this huge list of passwords. That's very noisy activity and quite detectable, obviously. So what you can do instead is, take maybe one well-known password, maybe from like a LinkedIn breach or some other data breach where perhaps it might apply to somebody in the organization. You get a short list of these, and instead of doing one specific user, you're going to do this across every user at a time, and then maybe move on to the next password, and they're going to try every user again. So it's just kind of a different perspective, I guess, is the way to say that, and how to do that kind of attack. So that's what we're seeing here. A few attempts in our machine.
And Kyle, keep me honest here. This is scarily effective because, as you mentioned, a typical brute force might lock out an account, and that's pretty easy to detect. But going this way, almost going horizontally, makes it much more difficult. You might have one maybe failed attempt for one account over a long span of time. So it might just look like, I know I fat finger my password pretty much every morning, waking up, turning on my laptop. This also can be really effective if the attacker, as you mentioned, did their homework and did some reconnaissance beforehand. Maybe they went to something like one of the username and password breaches that we've seen from LinkedIn a couple years ago, and a number of those other ones where they've scraped together the usernames and passwords. So if the victim of this type of attack has a username and password listed there and didn't change their password, time getting in. And Kyle, keep me honest here. You've seen this, I'm sure, time and time again, where this type of attack is very effective.
Absolutely, and increasingly we're seeing this more of a low and slow style of attack, where attackers have realized that too loud and you get caught too quickly. Take an approach like this, and you might go maybe a week or two undetected, and maybe even accomplish your end goal there and get access to an account that you shouldn't.
Yeah, that's scary. In this particular case, and in the lab, The attacker was not successful in this password spray attempt. But that doesn't mean the attacker's mission is over at that point. They're just going to move on to another technique. And I know, Kyle, you and I have talked about this, and Ryan and I have talked about this. We've seen just a massive rise in what's called Kerberoasting. So we're going to take a look at that, and I'll let you explain that to the audience as we go through, because this is, again, another common technique that attackers use to gain access to privileged accounts. So here we go on that, Kyle.
Yeah, and so what we're going to see here is like Kilian explained, a kind of a Kerberoasting attempt, right? So we're going to attempt to kind of enumerate service accounts, checking for SPNs, and then we're going to go ahead and request, as part of the Kerberos authentication, a service ticket, and then in doing so, you're able to then, essentially, if we can find out the hash of that service ticket to get it opened up, we have our plain text password, right? So what we're going to do is essentially take a number of maybe a dictionary list, and we're going to kind of hash those and then try that hash against this. The important part here is that at this point, we've already taken that hash offline, and we're doing all this cracking offline. So there's no waiting for network latency. There's no generating noise or authentication requests. This can all be done off, outside the visibility of the network, which again is increasingly frightening. But over time, perhaps in this case, it was successful. We see that just through, for example, like a rainbow table or taking those dictionaries and hashing them individually, running it against here, eventually we get that service ticket opened up. And that tells us that, hey, we've got a password and we've got probably an overprivileged service account in this case, to get maximum visibility into the file system and possibly sensitive data as well.
Absolutely. This one's a particularly scary one for a number of reasons that you mentioned, Kyle. But just to break it down a little bit more for the audience, what the attacker will do is basically just leverage completely standard, normal, anticipated functionality of Active Directory, but misuse it. So the first thing that they'll do is, as Kyle, you mentioned, they're going to look for service accounts out there, but very specific types of service accounts. And this is something you can do just normally. Hey, show me who's a service account that has an SPN. So with Active Directory, they will publish a list of services that users can interact with. However, they want to cross-compare that list with members of the domain admins group, so they can focus their attacks on accounts that are going to give them the most value. So this is completely normal functionality, but it's scary. So once they have that targeted list, Kyle, as you mentioned, they're going to leverage something that's still built into Active Directory to enable backwards compatibility. I think almost every organization probably has this enabled. It would be great if we could get rid of legacy support, but if we're still running older XP device or 2003 or things like that, we still need to have some of those backwards compatibility features turned on. So what the attacker does is pretend to be one of those old machines. And this you can do through Mimikatz, and there's a number of ways to do this. But it says basically, hey, I'm an older machine. I would love to access the services that you have available. Please send me the service ticket. And Active Directory will say, sure thing. That's what we do. But because they're an older machine, that service ticket will be encrypted with the RC4 hash of the service account password. And the RC4 hash is pretty weak. It's not salted. So as Kyle said, that's why the password cracking is so effective, because you can just run a rainbow table against it. And when the ticket opens up, the attacker knows that they have that right password. In this case, in our lab, it was very quick.
Right. No, and it often is, especially given that it's offline, right? So you get that full compute power and there's no really delay in each attempt. So it's incredibly effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kyle, that's a great point you mentioned too. Since this is offline, there's no additional interaction with Active Directory at this point. The attacker runs this to get the tickets. It's kind of odd unless you know what you're looking for, because you never see sort of the completion of the connection to access the service. But the attacker can take all the time that they need to crack these offline. And again, you can throw as much resources as you want at it. You can repurpose your mining rig with 10 GPUs in there to really get wild after it. But again, this is scarily effective, unfortunately. So at this point, kind of bringing us up to speed, the attacker has gotten in, found some juicy targets, and now at the end of this point in the process, they have access to potentially one or more accounts that give them more access, and here at the end of this one, an account that gives them admin rights. So they really have sort of the keys to the kingdom. They can establish different accounts, they can establish additional persistency, and open up additional backdoors or unlock access to what they're really after, the data at this point.
Absolutely.
So really, AD, there's a lot of scary things here. I know, Kyle, you investigated. What are some ways that organizations can detect some of these types of attacks and steps they can maybe take to detect this before it gets this far?
Yeah, I mean, built in, Varonis has the ability to look for, those SPNs, identifying legacy accounts, those accounts that do have the SPNs, and even when, a new SPN is created, for example, that helps reduce that attack surface and kind of prevent this kind of thing in the future.
Absolutely. And then definitely, Kyle, I think you'd agree with me. I know you do a lot of investigations here, but just monitoring Active Directory for these odd and unusual types
Absolutely.
of attempts, the password spray attempts or the Kerberoasting attempts. And then typically, Kyle, from there, once if you spotted one of these or when you do an investigation, what's sort of the next step that you would do from there?
As far as remediation goes, or I'm sorry.
Excuse me, for investigation. So let's say you've got this alert and someone contacted you. What would sort of the next steps be in your investigation process?
I mean, the first thing I'm doing is I'm reviewing the activity that account's doing. Is it behaving outside of its normal profile or what we've established to be normal at that point? Looking for activity from, service accounts that we know perhaps shouldn't be user driven. Suddenly they're accessing directories that they have never gone to before. Suddenly they're accessing sensitive data for the first time or accessing the internet for the first time. These are all great red flags that I think can be smoking guns for indicators of compromise.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And that's something that I think the audience would really appreciate knowing is that once we have one of these pieces of information, checking the device for other accounts that are logging in there that typically don't. That's a big red flag. And then, of course, the biggest red flag, what did the account do next, especially when it comes to accessing data? And that's a great point to leave off in this episode. That's what we're going to talk about next time, really what that next step is and how the attackers leverage these credentials to find data that they'd like to steal and then exfiltrate it. So, Kyle, great explanation. Thanks so much. That was
Thank you.
really fantastic that you dove in there and gave the audience a nice overview of these particular attacks and what to look out for. So, thank you. Appreciate it, man. Thank you all for watching. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoy this content. We put out at least one video per week. And if you do like it, maybe consider throwing us a thumbs up or leaving a comment. We always read those. We always enjoy those. So, Kyle, thank you again for taking the time. Thank you all for watching. We'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Take care.